Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Tell me in the comments below. Now let's get into the story. A soldier with a single child was cast out in the late afternoon sleet and gray light. Days later, a small scrap of paper, an uneven, crayon-smeared inquiry, forced those who had closed their doors to bow their heads and earned the wary respect of a neighborhood that had been too polite to ask questions. He arrived to the street he had known his whole adult life and felt immediately that something had been altered in a way he could not yet name. The houses wore their holiday lights like ornaments on a face turned away. The air smelled of wet leaves and car exhaust. Snow threatened but had not yet committed. The soldier walked with an old stiffness to his shoulders, the posture of someone who had been practiced to hold himself still against the world. He was back from a tour that felt longer in ways numbers could not hold. Months in a place where the light had been the color of metal and the people's voices were clipped by fear and necessity. He had come home with hands that did not know how to hold household things and a mind full of fractions of conversations that told him nothing and everything. He had come hoping to rebuild a life from the kind of quiet things other people called ordinary. A dinner at the kitchen table, the sound of the washing machine, a child's laugh. He found the house he had left unchanged from the outside and wrong from the inside. The door opened on a winter-clean smell, the kind that said no one lived here carelessly. A smell as polished as a showroom. The hallway was too neat. Shoes aligned like soldiers, coats hung straight on pegs, surfaces wiped of fingerprints. The living room light was on, soft, shaded, and the tree in the corner glowed with small globes of cool white. Every ornament was perfectly spaced. The hearth had a row of stockings that looked practice-made, promising and precise. The house did not feel vacant. It felt arranged, curated like a photograph someone had painstakingly retouched. He had expected the child to be raucous. He had hoped for it, the kind of hope that is more like a wish you whisper into a folded photograph. Instead, he found a small figure beneath the tree hunched over a pile of discarded gift wrap and a shoebox that might once have held shoes. The girl's hair was cut close enough to be practical. Her coat was too thin and frayed at the cuffs. She was digging with careful, patient movements, fingers screened for treasure. Her face, lit in the colored light, was small and intent. For a moment he thought she was making something, threading a ribbon perhaps. But then she lifted her head and the soldier saw a bruise on the inside of her wrist, a smudged purple like a question someone had given her. He felt his chest clench with the cold shock of recognition. A bruise is never just a bruise in the mind of a man who has seen broken things. The girl flinched when he spoke, turning as if the sound itself could injure. She did not speak. She held a thin paper, a child's drawing, the lines jagged as if the hand that had made it had been trying not to be noticed. She clutched it like an offering. The soldier felt, in the instant of her wary glance, the whole architecture of his caution collapse into one incandescent priority. He stepped forward and said her name. She did not answer. She slid the paper into her sleeve as if she believed hiding was a kind of armor. The soldier's voice softened. "Hey, I'm back," he said. It was the safest, simplest phrase he had, and the truth cut like light. He watched her weigh it, saw a tremor at the corner of her mouth that might have been a smile, and then saw something else. A tiny, practiced motion of lining her hands together as though to steady a cup. He had seen that motion before. In barracks it meant holding in the urge to speak because sometimes speaking could get you hurt. "Where's your coat?" the woman near the doorway asked crisply, the first sound of the antagonist's voice. She looked the part of a perfect caretaker. Hair done in an immaculate twist, a fitted sweater that declared competence, a smile as even as a line drawn with a ruler. She was the kind of person neighborhoods built committees around, the kind of woman who could make donations and chair events with the same measured breath. She was the reason their house had become like a photo studio, the reason every surface had been curated. A primary caretaker introduced in the first 5% of his return, as the rules of a life insisted. "She's been fine all day," the woman said. "She likes working with ribbons. It's a quiet time for her. You should be careful not to startle her. She doesn't—" Her voice slid into a parental shorthand that implied knowledge and control. The soldier's mouth kept itself a neutral line and his hands remained visible. He introduced himself, briefer than polite, and the woman nodded in the way professionals nod at someone they must placate. "We heard you were coming back soon," she said. "We made room. Thought you'd want to come by before dinner." She stood at the door with an air of placid authority that made even the house's stiffness seem active rather than anxious. He wanted to ask, to tear the fabric of explanation from her and watch it fall, but his old training taught him to look for the gap between words and action. There was a gap now. Her hands were spotless. When she moved, the bracelets at her wrist chimed a careful sound, a distraction like applause. The soldier noticed the child watched the bracelets, not the woman. The bracelet moved and the child's small fingers tightened around the paper. The soldier's suspicion bloomed like cold fire. He allowed, on purpose, to be led through a tour of the night. The kitchen table was set but unoccupied. The children's place was marked with a simple plate with a cartoon, the napkin folded into a precise rectangle. The woman's voice described the child's eating habits, the schools she'd visit, the doctors she'd seen. Everything was inventory, everything a spoken list of tasks, a perfect life described like an invoice. In the hallway mirror he saw his face reflected back. A jaw a little too rigid, skin mottled with winter, eyes the color of a tired room. The reflection was, for a moment, of someone dislocated from the tenure of domestic routine. He remembered his failure, when a decision on a field had cost another man's life in a flash where there's no second-guessing, only a slow unspooling of guilt. He had left after that, feeling unfit to stay. The soldier's return carried that old wound, a conviction that he had failed those he'd been meant to protect. Now, his hands were steady for different reasons. He had a new failure to avoid. He told himself he would not leave this child to an answer that didn't hold her. Night came like an exhale. The woman cooked with a demonstrative ease, plating a single serving for the girl in an arrangement too pretty for the microwave. Words between adults were measured and calm, but every calm was edged. He watched the girl eat as though it were an exam. She took little, mechanical bites, eyes mostly on the tree lights. Once, her hand paused and a muscle around her jaw flickered. He caught the ghost of a sob that would not be allowed full voice. The soldier's chest tightened until the knuckles whitened. He spent the night awake, listening to the house's little mechanical sounds, the fridge humming, a clock's soft tick, interpreting them like Morse. He heard a creak in the child's room at 3:15. He stood and moved like a man who had been taught to breathe to the cadence of danger. The child's door was a thin slice of shadow. He knocked. She did not answer. He opened the door and found the child curled around a small stuffed bear with one ear threadbare. The child had drawn crude pictures and pinned them to the wall, each a jagged constellation of shapes. One drawing showed a house with a line across it like a seam. Another had a figure grinning without eyes. He picked one up and read it. A scribble, a small series of black marks that looked like stars arranged haphazardly. On the bottom corner, in a different layer of crayon, a single word, "Stop," a tiny, childlike plea. The soldier could feel old pots of guilt shifting in his chest. He would not let this be another thing he failed at. The woman had explained the bruise away in a way designed to end questions. She scraped it on the corner of the coffee table, she'd said, with a smile that asked for faith. Kids get into things, but the bruise's placement, soft inner wrist, was too intimate for an accidental scrape. The soldier's mind filed the inconsistency and set to watch. He moved like a man collecting evidence from the subtle world of small things. He spent the next week not confronting, not accusing with the blunt force of a shout. That was not his style. He was a patient man, and he had learned in the field that timing is everything. The investigation began with small, steady steps. He watched what she ate and what she didn't. He cataloged the child's clothing, matching brands and wear patterns, and he compared them to the neighborhood list he compiled in his head of who could afford what. He checked the child's teeth, small, pale, and how she reacted when the woman entered the room. Her shoulders tensed like a spring. He looked for allies, silent observers in a place that had been too polite to stare. He started with Mrs. Alvarez, who lived 2 doors down and had windows that shone with the inside of a storehouse. She saw things mostly because the apartment window gave a stage view of the street. She was a small woman with a lantern laugh and a catalogue of other people's tragedies filed in a steady memory. He invited her for coffee at a neutral time and watched for the way she shuffled and avoided glancing at his hands before she finally told him what she had seen. The child sometimes left for school with no backpack. The child returned from play with hands that smelled of detergent like bleach soaked into skin. "I thought maybe she has bad eczema," Mrs. Alvarez said. "I thought that, and then I thought maybe I shouldn't think anything at all." Her whisper leaned into the room as if she feared the walls had ears. The soldier left with more questions than answers. He visited the school and spoke with the child's teacher, a slow, steady woman who wore her hair in a practical bun and who seemed to carry the patience of the town in her shoulders. The teacher's face softened and she took a breath like a diver about to submerge. "She doesn't talk much," the teacher said, "but she draws. She draws the same house over and over, and sometimes she gives me papers with holes cut in them. Last month, she brought a sandwich wrapped in newspaper. It made the other children look twice." The soldier asked for examples, and the teacher handed him a tattered manila folder. Inside was a collection of treasures. Images of houses with doors cut out, figures with no eyes, the same small word, "stop," scrawled in different colors. The soldier took the folder home and read through the child's private language like a code. The pictures were a diary in palimpsest. Over and over, the house appeared, drawn from different angles, roof lines and windows repeated like a fixation. Once, there was even a small stick figure outside the door holding a key. He folded the papers into the pocket of his jacket like a talisman and slept with one hand on the folded pages. He began to search the house in little clandestine ways. He offered to help with repairs, and while fixing a squeaky hinge he lingered in rooms, let his eyes roam over drawers, the underside of tables. He watched where the woman's keys sat. A small brass key on a ring with a single fob, polished by habit. He noticed the woman kept a medicine cabinet locked. She kept a bowl of candies for the child but guarded them with a precise step that suggested she was counting. His investigation reached its first tangible milestone in a day of ordinary domesticity. The woman left to run errands, an errand she described with the same measured cadence as someone reciting their resume. She kissed the child's forehead in a motion that was public and posturing and shut the door with the kind of finality that makes a heartbeat loud. The soldier waited until the footsteps receded and then moved with a cautious certainty. He found the bathroom locked the first 3 times he tried the handle. On the 4th, someone inside muttered the phrase, "I'll be," and he heard the bolt slide. He entered. On the shelf, behind a line of shampoo bottles, he found an ordinary object out of place. A small metal brush with short, dense bristles, like a scrubbing tool for kitchen grout. It was clean in the way things that are meant for display are cleaned. He picked it up and felt his stomach drop. The brush's handle had scuffs from fingernails and faint streaks of something pink on the base, the kind of residue that dries and flakes. He swallowed and set it back into place a century of self-control later. The soldier's tree of inference grew new branches. The brush could explain the bruises and certain patterns of skin abrasion he had seen. It fit the child's avoidance of certain lights and her refusal to let certain parts of her body be touched. He forced himself to stay composed. He combed the house for more clues. In a drawer under the sink, he found a small stack of photographic prints tucked in an envelope labeled "Routine" in the woman's precise handwriting. The photos were of the child in different days, most taken from behind. Some were close-ups of hands. One was of the child's wrist, shot at a particular angle that showed the curve of the bruise. The woman had written little notes on the margins. Dates, short notations like "marked" or "lesson 12/9." The soldier's blood ran cold like ice pouring into metal. This was not accident. It was a methodical record-keeping, something like a log of corrections. He walked through the rest of that day a man with a tuned edge, like a blade sharpened for patience. He called an old friend, someone who had become an investigator after leaving the service, and described the situation in terms the friend would understand, careful, factual, without the hot blur of fury. The friend came by that evening and sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee as if drinking coffee could provide a base of calm from which to consider the facts. They made a plan. The friend, whose name was Aaron, ran background checks and brought a dossier back. The woman had an immaculate public record. Neighborhood volunteer, member of the PDA, references, a short paragraph about her love of children in the church newsletter. There was nothing in the system that would suggest malice. But Aaron, skilled in reading the bruises of stories that do not appear on official paper, found a footnote. A sealed juvenile court file from an earlier time, one that suggested the woman herself had been subject to a household that had been strict, punitive. There were dates and a line tooth of facts. Neglect, discipline that crossed into cruelty. The note was browned at the edges like something meant to be read only with gloves. The soldier read the report in a room with the blinds drawn and a kettle soft, whispering steam curling from its spout. He folded the paper and held it until the corners softened against his thumb. His past failure, leaving a man because he had been the wrong kind of father in a moment when leadership had meant something else, settled into a new urgency. He could not fail this time. He would not left a child's life to the same hungry dark. He returned to the house and began putting his plan into action. He needed more evidence. He needed witnesses, proof that could stand up if the legal world demanded it. He needed to protect the child in ways that did not make the situation worse. He learned her rhythms and sat in the wings of the home like a soldier on night watch, aware of every micro-movement, of the way the child avoided eye contact during certain games, the way she washed her hands until her knuckles shone with the telltale shine of overwashing. He saw the child tuck notes into the lining of her coat, slips of paper with drawings. He began to gather those notes discreetly, photographing them with a small device and slipping the originals back where he had found them. One night, as he sat at the kitchen table pretending to read a checklist of house repairs, the child happened to pass with a small basket of laundry. Her hands brushed his and he could feel the paper inside her sleeve. The contact was brief but revealed the tremor of a contained life that wanted to escape. The child paused and met his eyes for the longest instant they ever had. Something like recognition flashed through, not of his name but of a safety possibility. She did not speak. She allowed herself to be near him. That small allowance became the coal that would kindle a fire of trust in her. Trust in her, however, was not an event. It was a series of tolerable small moments, many of them wordless. He would not predicate a rescue on a single night's impulse. He kept Aaron updated with low, factual messages. They planned a raid of truth the only way men like them knew how, quietly, methodically, with instruments of proof. The soldier also learned the woman's rhythms. Her panic response had a pattern that could be exploited. She liked control, particularly over the child's time and surroundings. She liked to regulate access. One afternoon, while the woman hosted a holiday committee meeting in the dining room, the soldier asked if he might take the child out for a walk to see the neighborhood decorations. The woman hesitated, measuring the ask as if weighing risk. She gave permission with a glance that said she was confident the child would behave. She had not seen the soldier as a variable. Outside, the child kept close to him. He let her lead for a while, trusting the path she wanted, following, learning the small things about her gait, the way she looked at the stars. At a small park they stopped and he asked, simply, "Can you show me your favorite drawing?" The child sat on the swing like a bird learning to perch. She took a scrap from her coat, a drawing of a house with the door crossed out. Her hands shook. She looked up at him and whispered a fragment of a sentence under her breath. A line so small it might have been a child's made-up word. The door closed. It was not enough to tell an adult what happened. It was a clue. That whisper was the soldier's turning point. He had the patience to stall, to gather, to plan, but he also had a human heart that moved with the urgency of a father. He had been a protector once and had left behind an empty chair of remorse. He resolved to act before the winter closed in and before the woman could harden the child's silence into an ordinary thing. He planned the confrontation not as a reckless battlefield charge, but as a surgical event. Document, witness, safe extraction. Aaron's background checks had turned up an old acquaintance of the woman, a man who had since moved away but who now, after a hesitant phone call, said he would come and speak. They also had the teacher's notes and the photographs the soldier had found. These were layers of proof that layered into inevitability. Before moving forward, the soldier sat with his own past, as required by the rules of his emotional transformation. He thought of the night he had left, the last argument with a man who had looked at him like a son expecting an impossible steadiness. He remembered the sound of his wife's voice the night before she died, a quiet goodbye he had not been able to answer. The soldier's mind assembled those shards in the warm light of his kitchen and made them into a vow. He would not leave this child to echo ghostly things like the failure he had carried. He would be different. He had to be different. The day of the planned disclosure was a snow-bright morning. He moved like an officer executing a plan. Aaron was waiting in the car with a compact recorder and a second phone loaded with a direct line to the child's teacher and a neighbor's witness who had promised to look out of their window at a certain time. The soldier brought the child out under the guise of seeing lights. The woman watched, hands clasped, calculating. She allowed the child to go, smiling the smile of someone who believed no damage could come to her authority. In the park, the soldier let the child settle and do what she wanted. Sweep the frozen dirt with a stick, watch the birds. He spoke softly, non-intrusively. Eventually, the child made a small motion. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out the same tiny paper drawings, a hand so small it looked like it might break. She handed one to him without looking up. It was a picture of the house with the door penciled dark, and inside, a figure with marks at the wrist. Someone had tried to make a window into a life. He accepted the paper as if it were something precious as a stone. Aaron, in the car, activated the recorder. The soldier spoke so the microphone might pick up a floor of calmness, asking the child in the simplest terms if she wanted to come to a safer place for a while. The child's eyes lifted, and for the first time in a long while they held an unembarrassed warmth, like a sunbeam finding a long shaded leaf. She nodded. The motion was small, but it was whole. Returning to the house was an act of theater. The woman greeted them with a smile that did not touch her eyes. As the soldier walked past, he felt the house's air close like a mouth. He saw the woman trace her fingers around the child's wrist in an odd, possessive motion. He stepped forward, mindful of what the woman might do if provoked. He simply took the child's hand and said, "We're going to my truck. We'll be right back in a minute. Okay?" The woman bristled but said nothing. Her silence was a frost. Once in the car with the child strapped in, the soldier let the engine purr as if to ground them both in sound. He glowed with the deep-throated relief that comes from a plan's first simple success and also with the cold fear of its consequences. He drove to Aaron's apartment, then to a small rented room at a friend's place, places that smelled of coffee and human disorder. They sat there with hot beverages and with a pile of evidence between them like a new language. The soldier took the child's hand and offered her a sandwich wrapped in clean paper. She ate, slowly at first, suspicious of the ease of a thing. He let her nestle into a chair and pulled out a sketchbook and crayons. He did not ask for words. Instead, he set crayons where she could reach and let the child draw. She drew a house with the door open. The soldier felt something inside his chest, the slow bloom of attachment that begins as stock and grows into family. He had come, this time, to stay. But the world outside was practical and procedural. The soldier called the number Aaron had given him, an intake line, and a social worker arrived within the hour. She was quiet, a woman who carried the facts like a tool belt. She listened to the child's limited phrases and observed the way she held herself, the way she touched the bear's ear before offering the name in a syllable. The child whispered when she spoke, names and dates like ration things. The social worker was careful, patient, like someone who had learned that children tell truth in fragments. She explained where the child would be safe, what legal steps would follow, and emphasized the need for formal reports. The soldier cooperated with an almost mechanical precision because he knew the legal machine needed traction. He provided the photos, the recordings, and Aaron's notes. The social worker took the initial evidence, and the bureaucratic gears began to turn. But the woman had also started to mobilize. Her face in the next weeks was one of a person who felt a mask cracking. Her public persona, charity chair, perfect member, began to adjust defensively. She visited friends and neighbors, produced forged letters of reference, and sent messages that opened the safe places of the community like someone throwing stones at a glass house. The soldier watched with the vigilance of someone who had seen reputations used as weapons. He had to build a counterstack of witnesses. More evidence began to appear. The child's teacher brought a folder of further drawings and told a story of a parent-teacher conference where the woman had been cold and evasive, her answers clipped. A neighbor produced video of the woman leaving the house late at night carrying a plastic bag that smelled of household cleaners. No proof alone, but alongside the rest it became something heavy. Another neighbor, a delivery driver, recalled seeing the child at the window at odd hours and had started to take a different route to avoid the sensation that he could not reconcile. Each new account was a soft but relentless rain on the facade. The woman made a mistake during this time that accelerated everything. Toward the end of the month, she snapped publicly at a holiday gathering when someone praised her parenting. The soldier watched her face as she laughed too brightly, and then, across that room of people who had once praised her generosities, she pushed the child into a corner, wagged a finger and demanded she apologize for something vague, and then walked away. Her reaction, one of disproportionate fury, was witnessed by multiple people. A neighbor who had never cared to get involved in other people's houses found herself on the other side of the woman's wrath and, for the first time, told the soldier what she had witnessed. The child being made to kneel in a closet on a cold night for a trivial mistake. It was a small detail and gutting. It became the rivet that held the case. With the new evidence in hand, the soldier and Aaron executed the next phase. A controlled confrontation with authorities waiting. They arranged for the social worker and a police officer to conduct a welfare check in the presence of a neutral witness, while the soldier confronted the woman with phrasing designed to keep her off balance, to invite a collapse. The soldier's voice when he spoke was not the metal authority of his past, but something darker and steadier. A father's blush of fury that does not rage but holds the room like a loaded silence. When the authorities entered, the woman smiled like someone webbing herself in charm. But the sergeant was methodical and had the patience to read this kind of smile. He asked for the child's medical records and for an explanation of the bruises. She provided a notebook with the dates, with trivial excuses like bump and accident. The officer walked the house like a man inspecting a crime scene that smelled of domesticity. He opened the bathroom where the brush had been reported. The woman's face drew tight. Inside the cabinet, hidden behind bottles, the officer found the brush that matched the soldier's earlier observation. When asked about the photos labeled routine, she laughed something that was brittle. But the officer, having begun a procedural checklist, used the photographs, the witness statements, the visible signs, and the child's drawings to create a record that had weight beyond a neighbor's suspicion. The woman snapped in the presence of strangers, and her mask fell with a small, sharp sound. She accused the soldier of overstepping, of infantilizing, of maligning her reputation. Her voice shifted into franticness. In those moments the soldier saw the truth. Her persona, perfect, controlled, sanctified, had been a kind of contract to keep the world from looking inside. Beneath it was someone who had learned to turn fear into calibration. That calibration had been weaponized. The legal machinery moved slowly but surely. The child was placed in temporary protective custody and then, after an emergency hearing, placed in the soldier's care pending investigation. The woman was removed from the house and admonished not to return. For the first time in weeks, the soldier felt like something inside him could unclench. The child cried a sound that was small at first and then expanding, a noise that had been held down so long it feared to breathe. The soldier sat with her, wrapped a blanket like a shield around her shoulders, and let her pour out a tearful relief that gilded his heart like honey. He was now officially a father once more. The months that followed were a slow reclamation. The soldier found himself moving from protector to parent with the same careful mechanics he had practiced in the field. Ration the day, establish check-ins, manage supplies. He learned how to coax laughter from someone who had learned silence as survival. The first laugh was small, the result of a failed attempt to hold a spoon. The child's mouth had made a noise, surprised at itself, and then she had shrieked a light, unrehearsed sound that spread like warmth. Therapy began with a therapist who specialized in children who repaired from broken houses. The sessions were a kind of translation. The child's small drawings were read aloud and given meaning in a language she could tolerate. The soldier engaged with his own therapy, too, because he had learned that protecting another person required attending to the wound that had once made him leave. There was a terrible honesty in the sessions. The soldier had been taught long ago the cost of detachment, how a man who imagines himself immune can become blind. He laid his old failure on the therapist's table like a discarded uniform and found that, in naming things, they lost some of their power. Slowly, the child reclaimed the small things stolen from her. She kept a messy room now, clothes discarded in a trail like breadcrumbs of a life that included games and not just training. She took a class in painting and learned that colors could be used for things other than warnings. Her drawings shifted. The houses began to have open doors and windows, and once she drew the soldier with hair that stuck up and a big cartoon smile. The soldier taped that drawing on the refrigerator and admitted, aloud, that it meant more than any medal. The child's trust needed time. It could not be rushed. There were nights she still woke with a small shriek and clutched the bear so tight its ear might fall off. He sat with her in the dark till the light came. The woman faced consequences. The record assembled by the soldier, Aaron, the neighbors, and the teacher was not a single spear but a net. She was removed from her position on the PDA and from other civic functions. The police investigation found patterns that required her to answer in court for her actions. The woman, once considered a paragon, found the world closing in with the same relentless examination she had once used to order her house. She contended in public that she had been misinterpreted, that her methods had been benevolent, that she had tried to shape the child for a world that would be cruel. Some neighbors argued that a harsh method could sometimes be proper. Others testified to what they'd seen. The soldier watched the woman's face as she testified and found no triumph there, only a small ferocity that looked like a wounded animal's last bluff. During the trial, the child's presence was minimal but crucial. She sat mostly quiet, clutching the bear at her knees, eyes wide and fierce like a creature that had been turned to watch. When asked if she wanted to speak, she opened her mouth once and said nothing, then shook her head. The court's processes were not neat, and the woman's defense counsel worked to find loopholes. There were heated days where the soldier felt his old tendencies toward abrupt action burn within him, where he wanted to hurl accusations like grenades. But he learned the new discipline of channeling that into endurance. Attending hearings, providing documentation, being present when the child needed a hand to hold when the legal world invoked its routines. The final judgment was not the end of all things. The woman was found to have inflicted harm and was ordered into constrained custody and intensive therapy. Her legal punishment was less than some wanted and more than others thought, a compromise of a system that aims to weigh things in numbers and months. The judge's voice in the courtroom felt like a closing gate. It did not undo the past, but it placed an official prohibition around the woman's conduct. The soldier felt a kind of closure, but not a simplistic victory. The woman's internal capacity for redemption remained ambiguous, a possibility that could not be told in a courtroom transcript. The neighborhood reacted in waves. For every person who felt betrayed, there was someone else who had been stunned into reassessment. How does a community let itself be deceived by a smiling, efficient facade? There were church meetings and small, awkward dinners where people wanted to say the right thing but didn't know how. The soldier attended a meeting where neighbors asked questions and debated things like how to better watch for the invisible. The soldier's voice grew in the community, but it was never self-serious. It was a simple, plain account of what he had found and how one small act of vigilance, one refusal to accept a smile as proof of safety, had mattered. The child healed in the small ways that signify slow return. She learned to whistle a nonsense tune. She allowed a friend from school to spend the night, and in the morning they made pancakes with syrup smeared into the shape of funny creatures. She enrolled in a community theater class and memorized lines with fierce pleasure. Her drawings blossomed into landscapes. She grew used to a routine where her clothes might be unmatching in a way adults sometimes unintentionally loved. She learned to call the soldier Dad, in a way that sounded like a new word being tasted. The soldier's transformation from detachment to engaged father was not triumphant in some melodramatic way. It was incremental. He learned how to make chocolate chip pancakes without burning them beyond edibility. He listened for the small sounds that indicated nightmares and learned to sit with them as if they were guests he could not yet know how to comfort. He allowed himself to love someone else and to accept that his previous departures had been a mistake that could atone not by erasure but by commitment. Where once he had been a man who left so as not to harm, now he stayed so as to keep. There were moments of tenderness that unspooled quietly in the new domestic life. On an afternoon when the sun thinned and made the kitchen table glow like amber, the child set out a small tea party for two. Mismatched cups, a soggy cookie, a ragged napkin. She sat him in a chair and poured an imaginary cup. He accepted it like a sacred duty. They traded stories made up on the spot, impossible adventures in rooftops and stars, and sometimes just sat and listened to the wind examine the house. One night, as the child slept with her forehead on his chest, he felt the old soldier's rigidity melt like frost under sun. He realized he had been prepared to protect strangers and now found the most needing life was in this small form. The stakes were not abstract. They were immediate, honest, and tender. It was not an easy road. There were therapy setbacks. Once, the child retracted, withdrew, and demanded to sleep wrapped in her coat as if the world could be fought by adding another layer. The soldier learned patience the way one learns good aim. Practice, correction, steadiness. He learned to go to parent groups and listen, not to make judgments but to find fellowship in the ordinary embarrassments of tying a shoelace. He learned the logistics of a school calendar and the quiet diplomacy of carpooling. Time passed, and with time came the small, unassuming miracles of family life. A scraped knee treated without a lecture. A bedtime story repeated until both were bored with repetition yet felt the comfort of the ritual. They decorated a tree together, with decorations that were crooked and earnest and beloved. One winter evening, the child drew a new picture and hung it on the wall with a crooked thumbtack. A house with an open door and a figure with a broad smile. Under it, she had written in a childish hand, "Home." The soldier hung that drawing where he could see it from his bed, and it settled his chest in a way medals never had. The story of their rescue became, locally, a sort of quiet legend. Friends would approach him and ask blunt questions he had once been too shy to answer. He told them plainly. He had seen the wrongness and had chosen to act. He said the step that mattered was not a heroic single night but the hour-by-hour decisions to do the right thing over and over. It was a sentence that made people stare and, later, cry. He sometimes felt the strange sensation of being both the man who had failed once and the man who had made restitution now. He accepted both as a human truth. And yet, the question that lingers after such a closing is larger than the path of one woman and one soldier. How does a community miss a child in plain sight? How do neighbors prefer the comfort of assumptions to the risk of asking a hard question? The soldier had days where the rage returned and he imagined the woman's face as a lesson in complacency. He turned those days into a campaign of small civic acts. Host a neighborhood watch focused on care rather than suspicion. Push for better communication between schools and houses. Advocate for a community fund to support families in need so that necessity cannot be hidden behind charity. Winter thinned into a new spring of light. The child's laughter got louder and more frequent. And sometimes when she was deep in play she looked up and, without pretense, said, "Dad, come see what I made." Those words were not a trumpet and they did not erase the past. They were, instead, a continuing dialogue. The soldier would go and see and they would both look at what had been crafted together. Collage houses and painted skies. One evening, long after the woman had been removed from the house and the legal world had moved on, a neighbor knocked on the soldier's door and handed him a small envelope. Inside was a typed letter of apology from friends who had not acted sooner. It was the kind of note that does not repair but acknowledges, and it mattered in its own modest way. The soldier accepted it and folded it into a drawer where he kept things that were stepping stones. The child's growth continued. At school she performed a small piece about courage, a short recitation that made the soldier's eyes sting with moisture. She was asked by a classmate what bravery meant. She did not define it grandly. She said simply, "Bravery is letting somebody help you." The soldier looked at her through the crowd and felt the world tilt into a kinder angle. Years later, when she was older, 15 and messy in a way that was entirely her, the soldier found a stack of drawings on his kitchen table. He picked one out. It was a scribbled blueprint of a life she wanted to live. A house, yes, but also a school, a garden, a place marked with tiny stick figures. In the corner she had written in measured letters, "I am okay." He folded the paper to his chest and let himself, for a moment, believe it. He had not cured all wounds. He had not unmade the woman's history or the community's brief forgetfulness. But he had, in the silent, steady work of being present, trained another small life to demand an easier kind of belonging. The soldier's presence now had transformed into an ordinary ritual of being there. He took her to classes, sat in a folding chair at school recitals, and learned that ordinary things could be survival scaffolds. He learned to show up without needing a big speech. He learned to take complaints about chores with humor and to let the small domestic irritations become the very fabric of family. He learned how to apologize and to accept it when he was wrong about a curfew, about a misunderstanding, and to use language like a tool, not a weapon. Time, in its slow work, softened the battle lines. The woman, in her own place of consequence, sometimes wrote letters that were an odd mixture of apology and rationalization. They were never sent. They were discovered in the evidence stack, and the soldier would read them sometimes with a begrudging compassion. He understood, without excuse, the shapes that cruelty takes. She had been formed by a world that did not foster repair. Her pattern had been to use structure as a way to contain fear. She had been both perpetrator and product, a complicated person trapped in the need to perform perfection. One winter, many seasons after the first moment when he saw the child's bruise, the soldier stood at the edge of a community hall and saw the woman pass by in the crowd. Older, quiet, not the radiant presence of charity events, but a person who seemed diminished in an honest way. He did not seek her out. He did not need to watch the slow unspooling of consequence to have satisfaction. The city had done its work. He had done his. The child had flourished within a home that had steady heat and a man who would not leave. He never forgot, however, the first scrap of paper with the crayon word, "Stop," in the shaky corner. He kept it folded in the back of a drawer, and sometimes, late at night when the house slept, he would take it out and look at the small handwriting and measure how far they had come. It was, in many ways, the artifact of their survival. Now, months later, he sits at a kitchen table that is alive with both the noise and the quiet of family. On the far wall hangs the child's first big painting, an explosion of color that had once seemed impossible. There are dishes piled in the sink and mail that must be sorted. The soldier makes coffee, his hands steady. The child, now more woman than girl, is by the window, pulling on a sweater and making a quick, exaggerated face at someone on her phone. The soldier watches her and remembers the night he saw her in the Christmas lights, a small figure searching through wreckage. There are scars. They are quiet things, like a faint seam in a wooden table you can only see when the light hits it right. The child's nightmares come sometimes, still, and there are days when community kindness returns in the form of small practicalities. Meals brought by neighbors, a teacher's check-in email, a friend's text. These things matter. They are the mortar that helps hold the rest together. The soldier has also grown. In going from detached protector to present father, he has found a new purpose: to teach his child how to ask for help, and to teach his community that being a neighbor means seeing and acting. He also learned to forgive himself, never as a single instance but as a process. He learned that bravery is not only the act of confronting abuse but the ongoing act of listening, building trust, and saying yes to the small, steady duties that make a life livable. There is one more thing that becomes part of their life: a small ritual at Christmas. Each year, the child insists on donating a handmade ornament to be placed on a community tree with a note that says, "For those who need it." The soldier watches as she pins her imperfect ornament on the tree among 1,000 other lights. It's not a grand gesture but a daily one. The child had once scavenged through waste and discarded wrappers for something to make into beauty. Now she made beauty for others. When a neighbor asked the soldier once how he could bear to return to the place where he'd endured his own losses, he answered plainly, Because staying means I get to see what grows back, he would not let himself idolize pain. He honored it by making sure it did not have the last word. In the end, the community's trust was altered but not destroyed. People learned, slowly, that being observed was not about suspicion alone but about care. They attended training programs the soldier helped set up on recognizing signs of harm. They started a modest fund for emergency childcare and began to think differently about how they shared the work of watching out for the young. And then the day came, a simple morning in the later winter, when the now older child, who had learned to carry a different kind of light, left a small note on the kitchen table. It read, without drama, "Thank you for staying." The soldier folded the note carefully and slipped it into the folded corner of the stop drawing, sealing their past and present together in a drawer that had become a kind of world. Before I close, I want to speak directly to you. Have you ever walked past a house you thought you knew and felt a small, strange hesitance? A touch like a cold draft under a door you swear you shut? How do you respond when something about a neighbor's life sets your teeth on edge? Do you wait for proof? Or do you ask a question? Do you make a small act of noticing part of your daily routine? These are hard things to ask because they call us to risk awkwardness and be human in the face of another's possible pain. I'm asking you to consider them now. If the story moved you, if a memory rose in your chest of a moment you looked away, what would you do differently next time? Share a time when you stepped in. What did you do and how did it turn out? Or if you didn't act, what stopped you? Your small confession might be the first tile of a mosaic that helps others find their way. Tell me, where are you watching from today, and what will you do the next time you see a little wrongness in an ordinary place?